Good afternoon, and welcome to the 10th Annual Sacred Trust History Talks and Book Signing Event presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service at Gettysburg. Over the years, as we've presented Sacred Trust, we have had the pleasure of hosting renowned Civil War historians and authors, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides here so that they can share their unique perspectives on history, the Battle of Gettysburg, 1864, and the American Civil War. For our first topic of the afternoon, Heath Hardage Lee will present Winnie Davis, daughter of the Confederacy and last casualty of the Lost Cause. Winnie Davis, an icon of the Lost Cause, eclipsed even her father in popularity. Miss Lee's talk will explore Winnie's role and the conflicts she faced throughout her adult life. Heath Lee comes from a museum education, historic preservation, and a writing background. A freelance writer, she's worked with many nonprofits and museums creating educational programs, researching and writing grants, and funding materials. She is currently working as the History Series Coordinator for Salisbury House and Gardens in Iowa, where she brings prominent scholars and biographers together for lectures and educational workshops with public schools. Please join me in a warm Sacred Trust welcome for Heath Hardage Lee.
Well, thank you, Cindy. That was a very nice introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm thrilled to be here at Gettysburg this July 4th weekend, speaking to you about my new biography, Winnie Davis, Daughter of the Lost Cause. Before I begin, I do want to thank a few other Gettysburg Foundation staffers, Dan Welch and Mandy Moore, for inviting me to be part of the Sacred Trust events for 2014. I also want to thank my Pennsylvania friends, Deb and Walt Boyson, for their superb tour of the battlefields last night here. The sunset here was spectacular. It's amazing. I want to begin my talk with a very short excerpt from my book, just to set the scene for you, those of you who don't know a lot about Richmond or the southern side of the conflict. It's late spring, 1864 in Richmond. Dashing young Confederate General Jeb Stuart has recently died from severe wounds sustained in the Battle of Yellow Tavern. The city is deep in mourning. Just a few weeks later, my subject, Varina Anne Winnie Davis, the youngest child of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and his second wife, Varina, is born at the White House of the Confederacy in Richmond. My excerpt begins with Varina, Winnie's mother, writing her mother about the current state of chaos in the Confederate capital. Varina wrote to her mother on May 22, 1864, telling her about Jeb Stuart's tragic death and the general atmosphere of panic and chaos that reigned in Richmond at that time. In her letter, Varina noted that her husband had displayed a total lack of regard for his personal safety. Quote, Jefferson has been forced from home constantly and in various battles around Richmond has been pretty constantly in the field. I hear that at Drury's Bluff, he was very much exposed. A man's drum was taken off by a shell 5 feet from him. Varina also clearly saw the mental toll the war was taking on her husband, who had always had a nervous temperament. Quote, Jeff is much worn by anxiety. He seems to have got nearly as bad as I am, and I hear the roar of artillery and the crack of musketry, it seems to me, all the time. She concludes with a gloomy description of Richmond in crisis. Quote, there is an immense deal of suffering here now, so much so that they are impressing servants in the street to nurse the wounded. Winnie was then born into this war-torn environment on June 27, 1864, in her parents' ornate mahogany bed, draped with filmy mosquito netting. The baby arrived not simply in the midst of Civil War battles and political maneuvers, but also during a very personal period of parental grief. Both parents were still deep in mourning for little Joe, their son who had recently died. Emotions and stress were running high throughout the Davis household. Surely, as a result of this tense environment, Winnie was always hyper attuned to her parents' needs and moods. Winnie partially filled a gap in both her mother and father's hearts. While she could not totally bridge the voids left by the deaths of two brothers, her presence still helped both parents tremendously. Before Winnie was even conscious of her surroundings, she became a salve to her parents' psychic wounds, as well as the spirits of beleaguered Confederate troops. Superstitious Southern soldiers viewed the passing of Jeb Stuart as an ominous sign. The arrival of Winnie, however, seemed to counteract their feelings of dread, at least temporarily. The birth of the last child of Confederate President Jefferson Davis was thought to be a good omen for the Confederate forces battling Union soldiers. Winnie's arrival was heralded by one and all as a blessing to Southerners weary of the war. In the late 1920s, Aaron Opfa Moore Rowland, Varina's first biographer, wrote of the child's birth, quote, "Born amid the victories that had saved the city of Richmond from the enemy, it was thought to be a happy augury, and General Lee came and held the infant in his arms." So that kind of sets the scene a little bit for what Winnie is born into, a war-torn, chaotic environment. These rifles and muskets are going off constantly. You can hear everything. And her mother is just trying to keep the family together while her father, Jefferson, runs the southern side of the war. So I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation with lots of pictures. I think visuals help so much to get into this world. So we're going to start with the portrait, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I found this and how it sparked my interest in Winnie. So this is a portrait of Winnie from 1897. It's a posthumous portrait, and I always tell everyone, I hope I look this good when I'm dead. That would be nice. Winnie was beautiful. This is very, very much what she looked like. But I saw this portrait and other portraits like it as a teenager in Richmond growing up, and I always wondered about who this woman was. She looks so sad in the picture, and her sad kind of melancholy expression is what really attracted me. The other things that I found interesting were all these sort of symbols that are in this portrait. And what this portrait really is a propaganda picture. The Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy wanted to project a certain image for Winnie even after the war, that she was the daughter of the Confederacy. She is a symbol of the lost cause and all that represents. And I'll get into that in the talk. The first thing, she's wearing this white dress. She looks like a bride. She's sort of a Vestal Virgin of the Confederacy. She has a red ribbon badge pinned on her bodice. This is a Confederate Veterans medal, showing that she's sort of owned by the Confederacy. She's part and parcel of it, and she's really a family member. She's been adopted by the veterans as part of their tribe. So that shows sort of the ownership there of the Confederate soldiers, and also the ladies of the Confederacy. Then you have in the corner, you have the broken staff, which represents the Confederacy itself. It's broken, but it is not gone or forgotten. Victorians, many of you may know, they love flower symbolism. So you're always going to see some flower symbolism in a Victorian portrait, and you've got the forget-me-nots with the broken staff. Don't forget the sacrifices of Confederate soldiers, the South, and the lost cause. So though the painting on first glance just looks like a beautiful portrait, if you dig just a little deeper, there is a lot there, a lot of symbolism and a lot of propaganda. So I'm going to go back in time just a little bit. That portrait, as I said, was done after her death, but we need to go back to the beginning and to her family to understand the dynamics that are going on when Winnie is born. And I've read to you just a little bit about that already. So her parents, as you know, are Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Varina Davis, who is his second wife. Does anybody know who Davis's first wife was? Excellent. This lady right here in black knows. Excellent job. Gold star. Zachary Taylor's daughter, Sarah Knox Taylor, was the first wife. And Jefferson Davis was besotted with her beyond belief, and she with him. Zachary Taylor opposed the marriage. He did not want his daughter to have a military life like he and his wife had had. But Sarah and Jefferson were dead set. Like most young people, when they fall in love, they were like, we're getting married regardless. They did it without Zachary Taylor and his wife at the wedding. 3 months into the marriage, Sarah contracts malaria and dies in Jefferson Davis's arms. So it is a short marriage. It doesn't leave any time for nagging, for somebody to not pick their socks up off the floor. There's none of that. And so Sarah is always known by Varina, the second wife, as the sainted Sarah. She can do no wrong. And so Varina, 8 years later, comes into the picture. Davis has basically been a hermit on his plantation in Mississippi, not really going out, studying books, studying politics, running the plantation. His brother Joseph sets him up with Varina, who's another Mississippian from a prominent family, and they fall in love, or Davis decides it's just time to get married and to have children. In this picture, Varina looks very submissive. This is a very deceptive picture because Varina is a very modern woman. She would have fit right in with our century right now. She does not listen to Davis, nor he to her. So they're constantly at odds. They have this sort of epic battle of wills in their marriage. And this sets up the dynamic that all the children in their family are born into. So now I'm going to talk about little Joe, and I mentioned him in the passage that I read to you. Some of you may know this story, and being a Richmond girl, I grew up knowing this story well. There are many different versions of the story. Some are true, some are not. But little Joe, if you look at him, he just looks like trouble to me. Doesn't he look mischievous? He just has this little twinkle in his eye that you know he's going to get into trouble. And he frequently does. He is probably the favorite child of Varina and Jefferson at this point. They have other children. They have Maggie, the oldest girl. They have Jeff Jr. They have Billy. And then they have little Joe. And little Joe is the youngest one. He's about 5 in this picture. So one day, Jeff Jr., the older son, is out balancing, and I'll show you the picture, on the balcony of the White House of the Confederacy. His nanny, Catherine, they have an Irish nanny who shows up a lot in Mary Chestnut's diary, one of the famous diarists of the time, and Catherine is nowhere to be found. Jeff Jr. is out walking on the ridge of the balcony. Now here is a current picture of the White House of the Confederacy. This is what it looks like today. Years ago in 1864, in the 1860s, the balcony was up here. So it was a much higher balcony, and that brick pavement that you see below has been built up. So there's a sub-basement now, and if you fell from that balcony, it would be about a 20 to 25-foot fall. So Jeff Jr. is out the window balancing on the balcony. Little Joe comes out of the window, imitates his brother, and falls to his death off the balcony. And you can imagine how devastating this is for the Davises. They make it there before he dies. They hold him, and there's a great description of a Confederate officer who comes by to help, and he says it's like the last gleaming of the wick in the socket of a light, and the eyes just close. So it was really tragic and graphically described by all the Richmond newspapers. So Joe has died, and what I have not mentioned, or you'll find it in the book, but they've also lost a son, Samuel Emery, to measles before Joe even arrives. So now they've lost 2 of their sons. Varina is heavily pregnant with Winnie, and Winnie is going to arrive about 6 weeks after Joe dies. So again, this sort of environment Winnie is born into is very chaotic, filled with grief, very, very emotional time for her family. So you can imagine, that fall and what havoc it wreaked on everyone. Let's see if this will. Okay. So Winnie becomes Joe. Varina had described as my best and brightest. She was not very politically correct with any of her children. She liked to label them all. Joe was the one they had sort of pinned all their hopes on, she and Jefferson. And then he dies so tragically. So then Winnie comes into the picture, and I think this picture kind of says it all in terms of the relationship between Winnie and Varina. They're very bonded, perhaps too tightly. They develop maybe what might be called today, I refrained from using this in my book, but a kind of a codependent relationship, because Winnie is filling the gaps for all these dead children that they have lost and will continue to lose. And I think this is a really unusual 19th century photograph, because I'm sure you all have looked at so many of these if you're history buffs. They're usually very stiff, very posed, and no one's touching each other. And this is such an intimate portrait of a mother and a child. I think it really says a lot about the family. Jefferson Davis, also very close to his children, would get on the floor and ruin his dress pants all the time, and Varina would scold him for this. They adored their children, and they also spoiled their children. They didn't discipline them. They weren't your typical 19th century parents. And perhaps the death of all the children made them cherish the children even more. So here's a portrait of Winnie that I find particularly appropriate being in Pennsylvania. My daughter loves to watch this show called Dance Moms. The Abbey Lee Dance Company is located in Pittsburgh. I know way more about this than I really want to. But this picture makes me think of Dance Moms, because Varina, like the dance moms of today, was sort of a stage mother. She would dress Winnie up. She would recite all kinds of poetry, Shakespeare, even when she was really little. She would sort of parade her around like a prize pony, and she really was treated like royalty, like Confederate royalty. So I like to show this picture to show that stage moms are nothing new. They've been around for many, many centuries, and they will continue to be around. And then I love this picture of teenage Winnie, which I also like to embarrass my daughter, who's in the audience with, because she has such a sullen expression on her face. Kind of has a very typical teenager expression. She is 17 in this picture. She would have just come back from Germany. And in addition to being a sort of a typical teen, I think we may have, there we go. We've got it back up. In addition to being a typical teen, she also was in school in Germany, in boarding school for 5 years, did not see Jefferson for 5 years. Her mother would periodically be in England and would visit her. But she was very upset about being locked away in the convent, which was really what had happened. She was kind of shut up in the convent for quite a while. She learned a lot. She became known as one of the most educated women in the South and even in Europe, but she didn't know anything about American history, about the Confederacy, and this was deliberate. Her parents did not want her to know anything about it. They wanted her to just go to the convent, let them deal with things at home, and sort of erase that memory from her mind. So that was one reason they sent her away. Another reason, we think Varina may have had a nervous breakdown about the time when he was about 12 or 13. So Jefferson decided Varina could not handle it anymore, sent Winnie away. The third and most interesting reason that she was sent away that I dug up in my research, and I found a lot of letters about this, was that Winnie was very stubborn, very independent. And both her parents talk about the stubborn streak that she has and how they have got to crush this out of her, which is really funny because Varina was super bossy and very opinionated. So I can only guess that she knew how hard it was to be a woman in the 19th century and have opinions. And she didn't want Winnie to suffer that same fate where she was constantly going to be crushed. So she decided to do it for her. I don't know. It seems very strange. Jefferson was very much a man of his time. So I think for him that made a lot of sense. It was typical. He did not want a wife or a daughter that would defy him or be anything but submissive. So Winnie comes back from Germany. She is spirit accordingly crushed. She is much more approval-oriented, much more willing to do what her parents want her to do, and that was the objective of sending her away. But she will write very strongly against education abroad for women. Later, she'll write for Ladies' Home Journal saying it's a horrible idea and it makes you a stranger in your own land. She can't even say words like gingham. She has a lot of English words she doesn't really know. She's basically German with a European sort of focus on royalty. That's her political knowledge. So it's a very strange predicament to be in when you come back to the South, which is very provincial in comparison to all these royal courts you visited and all the things you've seen in Europe. So she does come back. She lives at Beauvoir in Mississippi, which I bet some of you may have been to Biloxi to see Beauvoir, which is the Jefferson Davis's mansion that plantation he inherits at a certain point from an admirer. So she lives down there with her parents for a number of years. And then after a couple of years, her father has written his memoirs, which have not been particularly well received. However, things start to trickle, political currents start to move, and he essentially becomes a martyr of the lost cause, like the George Washington of the lost cause, and his fame starts rising. His reputation begins being rehabilitated. He gets visitors like Oscar Wilde, who comes to Beauvoir. Just all these celebrities start appearing. And so his reputation's on the upswing. And at the same time, this is in the 1890s. This picture is taken really a little bit earlier, but this is in the 1890s. The ladies' associations, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Ladies' Memorial Associations, start raising funds successfully to have Confederate monuments throughout the South. So in 1886, even a little before then, she and her father, Winnie and her dad, go on a tour throughout the South to dedicate a bunch of these early monuments. And one day they're on a train. They're traveling all through the South. It's hot, April again, very hot in the South, dusty. They get off the train one day in West Point, Georgia. General John B. Gordon, who I bet many of you know from his military exploits, is there. He's the governor of Georgia. He's hosting them. Jefferson Davis is ill that day, and he spies this young, beautiful girl on the train. And he whisks her out to the back of the train and says, "I present to you the daughter of the Confederacy." And this is when her fate is sealed. From that day forward, she is the it girl of the Confederacy. Her image is on postcards all over the South. It's on things like liver pills, candy, crazy stuff. In the 19th century, it's fun to look at advertising, too, because, of course, it's not like the 60s, like Mad Men, when you actually might get paid something for your image or there might be a campaign. Your image is just randomly appropriated and there's no compensation. So Winnie becomes an image that everybody knows, and then the press starts following her. She becomes a celebrity almost instantly. She says nothing. She just is supposed to look pretty and bless events, being who she is with that pedigree that she has. And this is all well and good. She's fine with this for a while. But then in walks Alfred Wilkinson, who is a really good-looking, 6-foot-tall Harvard graduate, class of 1888 with Teddy Roosevelt. He lives in Syracuse, New York, and Winnie and her mother, Varina, go for a visit to Syracuse. They have northern friends who are all very excited for them to finally come to Syracuse for a visit. They've been pressing for years, and they've been worried about going because of, obviously, the hostile environment there to Southerners. But they finally cannot put the invitation off anymore. They go. They have a grand ball on James Street, which used to be the street in Syracuse, and Alfred shows up. He's invited because he's from one of the prominent families in Syracuse. He's a 28-year-old patent lawyer. He's so old. All the girls figure at 28. He is a bachelor. He's never getting married. He's ancient. My God, he's 28. So they decide he's not interested in women, but he sees Winnie and it's love at first sight. It's just like Romeo and Juliet. They meet at a party. So they start courting. She stays for an extended visit. They write letters back and forth. And before she leaves, And here's the two of them together, just, the Romeo of the North and the Juliet of the South, as they come to be known by many of the newspapers who cannot resist a good story like that, nor can I. And there's Winnie again, beautiful image. She's just the perfect Victorian heroine in just every way. But I did want to point out there's a few little skeletons in the closet with Fred. Some are actually out of the closet and some are in. The first one is obviously he is a Northerner. Confederate veterans cannot stand the idea that the daughter of the Confederacy would become engaged or even consider dating a Northerner. Because remember, this is just like 20-some years after the war, and the wounds are still fresh and very deep. So they just can't accept that. The veterans hate that idea. The ladies, United Daughters of the Confederacy, who have adopted Winnie as sort of their patron saint, are upset. Her parents, for some reason, are completely oblivious that this might be a problem, and they just don't seem to worry about it. Jefferson Davis is very pro-reconciliation from the get-go. So I think in his mind, he thinks, this could be a really good thing, and he wants her to be happy. He always is very concerned for her happiness. So he actually is fine with the match when Fred finally comes to ask for her hand. But when they're courting in Syracuse, one of the ironic places they court is on the porch of Fred's grandfather's house. And Fred's grandfather happens to be Samuel Joseph May, who is a very famous abolitionist, part of the Alcott family. He's up there with Garrison and all these famous abolitionists. So Fred is a Northerner. His grandfather's a famous abolitionist. Oh, and then they find out that Fred's father is an alcoholic and has drunk up the family fortune, embezzled money, etc., sold, silver, the family silver for drink. So there's a few little red flags maybe with Fred's family. However, Fred is an upstanding young man. He has a wonderful law practice. He's kind of rehabilitated the family fortunes. But there are a lot of obstacles in their path. And then the two do get engaged. Jefferson Davis gives his consent. It's all secret. It's all kept on the down low. They don't announce it to the papers yet, but families start hearing about it. Friends start hearing about it. Death threats start coming in. To Fred in particular, I saw a wonderful letter from a Confederate veteran from the Robert E. Lee Company saying, "Dear sir, we will kindly thank you to stay away from Winnie, our daughter of the Confederacy, or we will shoot a mini ball through your heart. Respectfully yours, Robert E. Lee Regiment." I love how I'm a Southerner too. We are always polite even when we're about to kill you. We try to be polite. That's one of our virtues. So I give that guy that much. But there were death threats coming into Fred, coming into also the Davis family received a lot of threatening letters that their lawyer kept. So they decide Winnie needs to go away. She needs to go away. She's getting nervous. She's about to have a nervous breakdown. So let's go do the 19th century thing, the cure, and go to the spas and have a break, which I keep praying someone will send me to do the cure, but it's just not happening. So Winnie was lucky enough. She got to go. And unbelievably, Varina sends Fred over, her boyfriend, to press his suit to set a marriage date. And who did they ask to chaperone but Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper baron, who is married to Kate Davis. She is a Davis family relative, a cousin of Jefferson's. And they are Winnie's fairy godparents. They whisk her away on trips. They pay for clothes. They're her social sponsors in the North. So they sound like great chaperons, don't they? Well, they're not. The worst chaperons ever of all time. Joseph is almost blind at this point. He is on his yacht, perpetually seeking cures for imaginary diseases, but he is truly going blind. Then Kate is about to embark on an affair with one of Joseph Pulitzer's colleagues at the World newspaper. She is very, very distracted. She is a socialite who loves to party, and she's a great friend to Winnie, but she is no chaperone. So these two, are not really chaperoning. Winnie and Fred are off jaunting around Italy and in the carriage alone all the time, doing whatever they want to do alone. So who knows what could happen? And there have been many rumors about what might have happened during that time. I can say that they definitely didn't have a chaperone. Varina and Jefferson, for some reason, didn't seem concerned. And I think part of it was that Jefferson Davis was dying. That usually takes precedence. So he was quite ill, and they did not want Winnie to know. So on this trip, Davis dies, which throws Winnie into even more of a nervous sort of panic. So they come back, and oops, I may have done it too hard. The engagement is called off. So Fred is brokenhearted. He cannot understand what has happened. But Winnie herself decides this is just, there's too much resistance in the South. The one who breaks it off, though, for her is her mother, Varina. When Fred comes to visit, she has the talk, the breakup talk, and breaks up with Fred for Winnie. And her mother often would do things like this, speak in Winnie's place, take over for her, and in this case decided that she wasn't going to marry him. Varina, and my theory on that, and you can read more in the book, but I think she could not give Winnie up. I think she just could not part with her. She was her companion and her nurse and her best friend. And I think after all the trauma the Davises went through, she just couldn't give her up. That's one reason. And there were some things in Fred's background that were a little alarming, as we've discussed. But Fred goes on to be a very successful patent lawyer, very wealthy. He never marries. He dies of a nervous breakdown years later. And he's seen at Winnie's funeral, she dies before him, crying in the back of St. Paul's Church in Richmond. So it's really a tragic love story. However, Winnie gets a consolation prize. I don't think she was really that excited about it, but she is named the Queen of Comus in New Orleans. Comus is one of the crews, the clubs in New Orleans that you read about. They have these fabulous parties during Mardi Gras, and she got to dress up. You see her here in the center with the ladies in her court. The theme was Nippon, Land of the Rising Sun. This is when Asian trade starts opening up, and it was this fabulous ball. She was sort of toasted by all of New Orleans and very sought after by many of the bachelors of New Orleans, but she would have none of it. I think Fred was her true love. Either that or she just decided that marriage wasn't for her, wasn't interested. She never really seemed to date anyone else again after that. Then the very exciting part of her life, to me, the most exciting part, is the last part of her life. She and her mother, Varina, decide to move to New York, which, again, in the South, post-war, you can imagine how people reacted. They also received threatening letters for abandoning their homeland, abandoning the South, and this looked really bad that they would possibly move away up north. Well, and there were a couple of reasons for this. They could not keep up the house, Beauvoir. They could not afford to keep it up. That was one reason. Number two, and more important, is financially, they were living in sort of genteel poverty. They had to support themselves. They were going to have to become women, career women who worked, or find some other sources of income. And there is a lot written about the literary lights of the South all go up north, not just even in literature, but doctors, lawyers. Everybody goes up north for work. They leave the South because there is no work. The landscape is devastated. The economy is in ruins. Many people are forced to make this exodus to New York. But Varina and Winnie make it gladly. Varina has always had very her loyalties have been a little bit divided. Her grandfather was governor of New Jersey. She has many northern cousins and tons of friends in the north, including a lot of Confederates that have already moved up north. So they go to New York. They live in a series of hotels. They have their own sort of literary salon where they have artists and intellectuals, actors, all these people that Jefferson Davis really did not approve of, kind of Oscar Wilde types that Varina loved and Winnie loved. They were both very artistic. Both were writers. And Joseph Pulitzer at The World, you remember The Worst Chaperone Ever, he turns out to be their financial savior. And he gives them both stipends to write for the World newspaper. So they have a wonderful life in New York, going to all these wonderful artistic events and writing and meeting interesting people, including Julia Grant. Varina and Julia become very good friends, and Nellie, Sartoris, who is Julia's daughter, and Winnie become very good friends, which I think is so wonderful. So they're kind of not even deliberately, but they're working on this reconciliation that Jefferson Davis himself wanted. They're doing it just organically with their interest and with their time in New York. And Winnie becomes sort of one of these, I call her the woman in white. She's sort of the symbol of these women of the 19th century that have a certain look, that Victorian heroine, pale and very slender and very ethereal. She's sort of still got the image as the daughter of the Confederacy, but now she is fulfilling her long-held desire to be a writer and a career woman. So in addition to writing for the world, she writes several well-received novels and starts making good money. Not enough for them to live like princesses or queens, but enough for them to pay their rent and live well in New York. And Varina is also writing for Pulitzer at the World, though he puts most of her stuff in the drawer and doesn't publish it. Varina is not the writer. She's a good stage mother, but she's not the writer that her daughter is. So they have their time in New York. Winnie is evolving from sort of the cult of true womanhood, true woman, that antebellum type of woman who's submissive and pious and pure, into the new woman, into sort of a Gibson girl. She loves bicycling. She loves her freedom in New York. So I show you here the Gibson girl, the model to which she is evolving. And given enough time, I think she would have continued to go that route. And I don't really think that the domestic life and marriage was truly what she valued. I think what she really valued was writing and creating and being an artist. What happens, unfortunately, and I'm going to tell you for educational purposes, sometimes I don't tell people, but this audience is so well read, you probably already know. Winnie dies at age 33 of something called malarial gastritis, which no doctor I've talked to has ever been able to pinpoint what in the world that is. The way she dies makes her the last casualty of the lost cause. She is in a carriage with Mrs. Stonewall Jackson at a reunion in Atlanta, Confederate Veterans reunion. So while Winnie is a writer in New York, she is still representing the lost cause, the Confederacy, and the legacy of Jefferson Davis by appearing at these Confederate events. So she and Mrs. Jackson are in the carriage. A downpour comes up. They're soaked to the skin. And the crowd is so great that they can't get out to get to the hotel to change clothes for many hours. There's a dance that night. Winnie goes and changes, goes to the dance. She feels she has to keep up her image as the daughter of the Confederacy. So she goes to this. The next morning, she gets on the train from Atlanta to go to Narragansett Pier, which is a very fashionable resort, or was at the time, right across from Newport. So it's that land of the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and that whole glamorous society. And she and her mother go every year and stay at the Rockingham Hotel in Narragansett Pier. So she goes, but she quickly declines. She has a high fever. She feels horrible. They cannot figure out what is wrong with her. But after several weeks of this kind of wasting away where she can't eat anything, she dies very unexpectedly. And her mother is a wreck. She is totally devastated. And at this point, Varina has also lost her other two sons. All four of her boys are dead. Jefferson Davis is dead. Maggie, her oldest daughter, has moved to Colorado Springs. Maggie is the only one that has children and continues the line of Jefferson Davis's descendants. Winnie dies, and this is just devastating for Varina. She continues to live on after this, but this is what really breaks her down because Winnie is her best friend. So she loses her, and Fred, I think, is also one of the last casualties of the lost causes. He dies many years later after coming to the funeral crying to see Winnie off. On her, when she dies, Fred dies later of a nervous breakdown. And much of my research led me to think that all the threats and the threats to his reputation and all the things that were thrown out by Confederate veterans had a long-lasting effect on him. So these two young people are sort of a last sacrifice to the lost cause. But the way that I like to remember Winnie is not as being in her grave and sadly dying at such a young age. But I like to remember her pedaling around Narragansett Pier, which she loved to do on her vacations, being free, writing her books, and really becoming the Gibson girl, becoming a liberated woman and a writer. And she did achieve that before her death. So that is comforting to think about that. Thank you so much. I wanted to see if anyone had any questions.
Being labeled the daughter of the Confederacy?
Excellent question from my friend Walt. He said, how did Jefferson Davis feel about Winnie being labeled the daughter of the Confederacy? I think he fully supported that label, as did Varina, her mother. This was sort of the legacy of the Davis family, and they both really wanted to carry that forward. And I think of the two, Varina even more strongly wanted her to keep that label, which seems strange if you want reconciliation, that you also want to keep this label going. But Varina always said, you've got to keep up with your father's friends. She was always pushing Winnie to keep representing her father. And I think she felt like it was the legacy of the Davis family. And I know the Confederate veterans thought that Winnie, that was her job, that was the legacy that she had to continue presenting, even though she was in New York being a writer, having a totally different life. It's a good question. Thank you. Yes.
I'm intrigued by the obvious similarities to the Lincoln family's
Yes.
personal lives during the war, and then for Mary and the children afterward.
Absolutely.
Or child. Do you deal with that in your book, or have other writers?
Yes. This is an excellent question, and I did not go into this a lot. There is a little bit in the book about it, and the question was about the similarities between the Lincoln family and the Davis family, and you are so right. Both these presidents, and I do talk about it some in the book, what they were dealing with in their personal life while the war was going on would have crushed most people into the ground. So just obvious parallels with all the sons dying in both families, and also the mental illness. And I talk a lot about that in the book, that the Davis family, and I know all the descendants, and they're very open about this, there's a lot of depression and anxiety in the family, some alcoholism. Jefferson Davis, and my theory on this, having spent a lot of time with the family and with papers that other scholars haven't seen, is that there were two types of depression in the family. There was Jefferson Davis had an innate depression that was sort of inborn, that I think Winnie inherited. They had a very nervous temperament. They had almost anorexic tendencies. Neither of them ate anything. Highly nervous people. Now, Winnie's, I think, might have even stayed under wraps, but that time in Germany and then the daughter of the Confederacy and all the pressure on her really brought that out. And I do think maybe her death, some of it may have been stomach, ulcers, things exacerbated by stress. Then Varina, I think, had more of a reactive form of depression, because I mentioned she had had a nervous breakdown. I mean, I would have been in the nut house too if 4 of my kids died. The war comes, you have no money, you go from being one of the wealthiest people in Mississippi to having no money, you have no home, your reputation is ruined. I think her depression was more reactive, but I think Winnie and Jefferson had a more innate depression. And of course, with Lincoln and Lincoln's family, there's a lot, of course, about Mary Todd and her struggles, and Lincoln also and his depression. So there are many parallels. And, I enjoyed writing this book too, to show you a little bit on the southern side that so many similar things were going on. And these were families in addition to being politicians. So that's an excellent question. Yes, that's right. Exactly. And that among the upper classes is was a very common thing, to send your children away to boarding school, but they are so homesick. And Winnie writes these horrible things about how awful it was. Like the water would be frozen in the pitchers, and they would do all these Spartan exercises and not have enough to eat. I mean, it really, it's a pretty Spartan lifestyle. On the other hand, she became one of the most educated women of her time. So interesting sort of conflicts there. Some good things and some bad things. Great questions. Yes.
This may be off topic, but after the war, was there a separation that Jefferson Davis was going on? Was he separated from the family certain way of time?
Yes, a good question. And I'm sure this gives me a good opportunity to talk about the Jefferson Davis and petticoats rumor, which I'm sure you've all heard, which is not true at all. His descendants just go bonkers on that. They're like, tell people this is not right. But yes, he was separated from his family. They evacuated when Richmond fell. Davis and his cabinet they waited till the very end. He had sent Varina and the children away 3 days earlier, and they were headed towards Charlotte, North Carolina, and they went through Chester, South Carolina. They were separated for several weeks, I believe, and then they meet up in Irwinville, Georgia, unadvisedly. Everyone's saying, do not meet up. This is a really bad idea. You're going to get captured. Of course they do. The children, everybody, Varina and Jefferson Davis. And the myth is that Davis was wearing a hoop skirt and petticoats and buttoned-up boots and all these great accessories, a bonnet, etc. Well, one, he wouldn't have had time to get that get-up on. And I love William C. Davis. He's a great Jefferson Davis historian. Has this great quote where he says, "Furthermore, Davis would have rather died than have been caught in petticoats." I mean, this was an affront to his manhood. It was Northern propaganda, and it was just how they could really stick it to the Confederates to question their manhood. And what's important about Winnie is that Winnie is always given, for some reason, as proof of his virility and that he can have children and he's a man, and he was not wearing petticoats. What he was wearing was a raglan cloak, which is a unisex cloak invented by Lord Raglan during the Crimean War. And it has like sleeves. I mean, it's a little feminine looking, but that's what he was wearing, and Varina had thrown it on him to protect him. And of course, he got furious at her for trying to save him and protect him, and that just did her no good. So yes, they were separated, they came back together, and then they were captured. Another excellent question. Yes, sure.
Where in Germany did she go to boarding school, and
Yes.
did she have to learn the language?
Yes, excellent question. She went to somewhere called Karlsruhe, which I believe is near Heidelberg. It's a tiny little town. And the boarding school, the building is still there. The boarding school obviously is not. She did have to learn German. She was fluent in German. She was always better in German than in English, which is really interesting. She also had to learn French. So she was fluent in German, French, and really wasn't fluent in English till she was home for a while. So knew her European history backwards and forwards, particularly her German history, witnessed some different events at the time that were interesting, but knew nothing of American history, and particularly nothing about the Civil War. And this was deliberate on her parents' part. They just did not want her to know about it. They thought they were protecting her, but what it did is made her a stranger in her own land when she came back. She was really odd, very exotic, and imagine basically a German princess being the daughter of the Confederacy. It's very strange, very ironic, and she never really quite fit in. Thank you. Good questions. Yes.
I'm curious if the events surrounding her illness and ultimate death attracted the same, for lack of a better word, media circus
Yes.
that we are accustomed to today when luminaries pass on. And also, where is she buried?
This is a superb question, and one I'm glad you brought up because we should talk about that. Think Princess Diana. That's exactly what it was like. She had the largest funeral, many scholars say, for any woman in the 19th century. It was a military funeral, which women never got, But Varina, again, stage mother even to the end, she insisted not only that Winnie have a military funeral, but she have a military funeral too. So they both got that. But it was a total media circus. She is buried at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, which I highly suggest you visit. They have wonderful tours. I'll be doing a TV thing with them, hopefully later in the fall, or we're hopefully going to work that out. Like a tour, because it's Davis Circle. It has everyone in the Davis family there, but it was a circus. It was just thousands of people and crazy. Great question. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.